I think we should just get started in any case. So good afternoon, everyone. This is the second presentation in a series where we are looking at how to apply systems thinking through health system science, which is one of the courses that is offered in the Bachelor of Health Sciences program. And what we spoke about last week, we started with a reading by Clark and Hoffman. And this reading in the Journal of Professional Nursing looked at strategies to teach systems thinking to prepare healthcare graduates. And we want to build on some of the points that came out of this reading, which were suggestions around how to impact curriculum in health science education to facilitate systems thinking. Some of the examples that were given were creating opportunities for interprofessional education, where different cadres within a faculty could get together around some of the topics, creating opportunities for peer-to-peer learning and mentoring, and developing 21st century skills and competencies through frameworks such as the team steps framework that they present, that specific framework in this paper. What we will talk to today is, first of all, looking at issues around the culture of teaching and learning in our faculty. Then we're going to look at a particular approach that we are applying. This has been presented on before, so we won't go into a huge amount of detail around how we have appropriated or have developed a deep and meaningful learning approach within a learning framework that we've been developing in this teaching space. And then to look at some examples in our courses of how we have developed interprofessional opportunities between different programs. We will also look at how we apply different lenses to make sense of the different topics that we cover that allow for different ways of seeing complexity within these topics. We'll discuss briefly an approach that we use around a writing intensive and reading centered approach to develop critical thinking. And we'll end with a discussion around the assessment practices that we have developed in these courses that, again, facilitate professional learning. Before we continue with this, I just wanted to welcome Catherine onto the call. We had a discussion last week. Last week, Catherine asked me some questions. And Catherine, I haven't had a chance to put these questions to you in advance, so I am putting you on the spot here. But I thought before we continue, would you mind sharing your reflection on the paper that we chose to read last week, particularly discussing perhaps some of the limitations of this paper in our context? And then we'll go on from there.
Thanks for passing the baton to me for a minute. I hope that I can be heard by everyone. One of the limitations in the discussion last week that came up right near the very end was Professor David Rubin and Professor Richard Cook talking about the particular kind of systems model that Hoffman and Clark use in their nursing environment at the University of Maryland. And it's got intensive input from a fairly high-tech medical infrastructure and an ability to track very closely the particular roles of different team members in an interprofessional but nurse-led team. And one of the points that was made just as we were wrapping up yesterday is that, and Stephen, you had actually opened the door to this in your final comments just before we opened to the floor, is that some of the ways in which the paper wraps up would really not be fit for purpose in South Africa. And that was the critique that David Rubin and Richard Cook were discussing. Would this be appropriate in our South African context, even though they might have agreed with a lot of the very strong and persuasive arguments made for systems thinking in the first part of the paper. But a second line of critique, and I'm sure many people here today who were there last week who got to the end of the paper would be nodding away. But the second part of the critique that we wanted to put to the paper and that helps us so much in our thinking for our work, is that the authors are not specifically concerned to link systems thinking and preparedness and interprofessional work with a humanistic or a human-focused curriculum. So there is very little in their discussion of what students need to know and prospective health professionals need to know about the context of a health system, in their case, the East Coast of America, and then their professional work, with history, with cultural theory, with religious and theological spaces that students come from, with class inequality, with gender differences, and with also the kinds of motivations and purposefulnesses that different kinds of people studying nursing or becoming clinical associates or medical doctors or any other kind of professional, what they bring to that space. It's as if that's just normalized, it's normative and expected. They lament, the authors, Clark and Hoffman, that students in their system don't know much about systems thinking. They don't have writing intensive backgrounds, and they don't know almost anything about the history of how their health system was formed, but then they leave it at that. And all the project work that they build in is about sort of gap filling around that. And that's really where I think the medical and health humanities perspective comes together beautifully with the health systems perspective, in the way that Stephen, myself, and the team, people such as Kat Parthas and Atemba Makanya and others, have actually been teaching in several degrees in our faculty. So I'll hand the baton back to you now, Stephen.
Thanks for that reflection, Catherine. So part of the reason or motivation for our learning approach that we've adapted in the department or been developing is in response to the kind of teaching and learning culture that we encounter in a health science faculty. And from the get-go, we recognize the need to situate systems thinking within a particular learning excellence framework. So this is actually from a paper that Yannis and Professor Cook and myself have been working on around how we can reimagine learning in health science faculties, considering different interrelated aspects of learning. The kind of learning philosophy that informs our curriculum development, the teaching and learning culture of an institution that in some ways is resistant to shifts and changes to practice because of the nature of professionalism of health cadres. And then what I'll discuss here a little bit more, which is most relevant to us, is the approach that we've taken in the curriculum, using a deep and meaningful learning approach to inculcate learning excellence. But before I move on to discussing that, because this has been presented before, I believe it's been presented before, I just want to ask you one more kind of poignant question. I might be putting you on the spot again here, but Catherine, in your reflection, having navigated the hallways of our faculty, how would you describe our our teaching and learning culture within this faculty?
Well, of course, there's huge variation, Stephen, so I would never characterize it in one way. But if you read the research on students' experiences in particular as they come into the physical infrastructure of the university when they first come across here to take courses, which for some people will be in first year and some people will be in third year, there is very little attention given to space, to the framing of the experience, to calling together the students and convening them as an audience. We do know that we've got the mission statement of the university's health science faculty printed into a glass perspex screen near to the water feature with the big koi fish as you come in. But in order for people to get there, they have to go through a very complex, exhausting security space. They have to walk through a space which is designed to welcome cars, not people. They have to walk around and under building equipment, which they've had to do almost continuously since about the year 2000. There was a period of about 15 years when there wasn't much building going on, but otherwise, photographs of the space show there's almost been continuous building, which students have to navigate. And when they come into the building with Adler on their left and the library on their right, there are very few works that address them. So some of the beautiful paintings that were made by the professor of hematology, Professor Deborah Glencross, otherwise known as Rousseau, when she's got her art hat on, that are actually made out of human blood tissue products, they move to the left but are not visually very focal, nor is the double helix made out of beautiful wire art. Unfortunately, that's also off to the side. And when you come into the main atrium, it's dark, the concrete is not relieved by a lot of light. The Adler Museum does try to welcome people in and students, but the forecourt is visually disorganized. A lot of the display cases are broken or non-functional, and areas where, for example, the elevator shafts, the bathrooms, the canteen, and the shop are, there's nothing that calls people together in a piazza, which all great universities in the world, whether they're in Senegal or Italy or on main campus at Wits when it was constructed, are built around. So there's nothing that convenes people and says, you are here in health science, you are valuable, you are part of this journey. And that continues for many students when they go into lectures and seminar rooms that are not working very well, when they have to use parts of the library that weren't created for the kinds of laboratory-based work they need, and where there are a whole range of different indicators to them in the culture, in the feel, in the space of the place, that they are not at the center of the experience. And of course, the whole setup also reminds us and them that there is a hospital on the other side of some of these structures struggling to exist with real human beings and their suffering. And so from the beginning, the chaos that can often happen in the physical infrastructure challenges of Charlotte Macleay, all resources are sort of directed there, and the students are in no way made to feel that they are, in a sense, the center. Where if you compare that to going to other health science faculties in South Africa, let alone the rest of the world, let alone Chancellor's College in Malawi or universities in places like Nairobi, there's a very, very different feel for how people are convened. And then I think so many of the struggles that we have for bringing together cohorts and creating solidarity follow from that, Stephen.
Yeah, thanks again for that reflection, and I think that speaks again to the focus not being on students, and how can we expect, or how do we shift the practice towards a humanistic approach to care if we ourselves are not doing that in our practice, or if the space is not welcoming or gesturing towards that way of being. So that's I think it was helpful just to frame this, why our shift then in terms of how we design curricula also needs to think or place the student at the center, their experience, and how they navigate this space. Because ultimately what we're wanting to do is to shift the practices and expectations of students, so that when they work or end up working in different areas in the health system, that they have the resilience really to address some of the key critical issues. It's not necessarily only about a set of highly trained skills, but it's also about many other kind of complex dimensions of the health system itself that they're going to encounter and need to be able to address. So the one area that we've been focusing on is a deep and meaningful learning approach to facilitate systems thinking in the way that we teach. And there are a number of aspects to this approach. For example, mirroring real-world learning, bringing in examples from the real-world context, being realistic about the state of our health system, the kinds of challenges that students might face, and the avenues or strategies that they can apply when faced with those kinds of challenges. Developing reflective practice, giving students space to step back and think about their learning journey, considering that it's that our courses, while all these programs are not exam focused, they don't have high stakes, pressured assessments necessarily, and that the student journey is going to be different for each person as they develop or inculcate their own personal interests in relation to what they're doing in becoming different kinds of professionals. So we think that that reflective practice is really important. Developing self-directed learning also relates to lifelong learning, how students have the skills to support themselves and to motivate themselves to do their own work. Building authenticity into our assessments too. For example, the kinds of writing that we want students to do, writing reports or briefs or things that they might have to do in practice in the real world. Collaborative learning, putting students in spaces where they can share peer-to-peer learning and working in teams, and then addressing some of the challenges that teams present around conflict, norming and storming and all those kinds of things, how to move from a group to people with a shared goal to try and achieve something. And then, of course, built into this at the top there, how we provide constructive feedback to get students to improve upon their learning. So this is an approach that has impacted the kinds of activities that we've built into our courses and our assessment practices to monitor whether they are successful in achieving that. All these things down the side I don't think are that important. These are just kinds of examples that we've drawn out from what we've done. And then importantly to this, which you can already see within that framework, is developing a set of competencies. So and we know that competence is not developed immediately, that people come in with different skill sets or different levels of competence, and that these are developed over time. So we have to think about it longitudinally and how we support and use these other forms of practice, for example, reflection, for students to learn to see how they are improving or shifting or changing in relation to developing skills that will help them in the workplace. This competency framework is something that we developed specifically for our courses in health system science, but they come from different frameworks. And just a caveat to say that the Bachelor of Health Science and MBBCH review is busy with a process of identifying non-clinical competence skills that are cross-cutting, and that would be relevant for any health science program. So this was a starting point for us, but we have found it very useful where we've defined these different competencies in relation to the context that we're presenting students with, which is a non-clinical, non-professional context, addressing complexity in health systems. And surrounding this is trying to link, again, developing ultimately a systems thinking approach, or here we use the noun, a systems thinker, who can draw on these competencies to address issues. Do you want to come in here, Catherine? Sorry,
I think in the interest of time, yeah. I think we should just let you steam on so that we can get to some of the
yes.
examples with
examples, yes.
Yeah, and then open it up.
Well, here we are at our examples already. So, okay. Yeah, and here I'm going to draw you in a little bit more. So what we've done is to create activities and assessments and things like that apply these approaches. And you can see, for example, that we make reference to our competency framework. So we'll say this is activity, this is the purpose of the activity, but what we're trying to do here is develop these interrelated competencies. And one example of interprofessional practice that we managed to get right was working with our clinical associate students in the BCMP and finding time in our curriculum through their academic days and through our timetabling to put health system science students in a room with clinical Bachelor of Clinical Medical Practice students, the clinical associates. And the kinds of topics that we addressed were cross-cutting topics where students were asked to think through a current concern. So, for example, we gave context here to what is the context of whistleblowing in our health system, what are the stages or steps that people can apply to do this, why is it important to speak out when there are challenges. So perhaps, Catherine, I could hand over to you here to give a little bit more context around how we set this thing up, what we were trying to address, and how the session actually flowed, and how you see this as an example of how we managed to achieve or develop some kind of systems thinking between two different groups of students.
Yeah, so I go back to an issue around architecture and space and convening a space, a kind of assembly. So very often when people go into a place like a lecture theatre, the way they set up were very, if you go into a lecture theatre that ascends up, there's this sense of a kind of hall that's been convened. In the case of the Steve Biko Theatre, which I think is one of the newest ones over in the Public Health Building, you have the speaker down at the bottom and the crowd and the audience goes up. Similarly in the Marie Curie Theatre. In other venues, there'll be a flat open space and the speakers will be at the front. One of the things that we've done with the Adler Museum, even though we've had very few resources because of the enormous pressure on using the resources that we have for care, for treatment, and for other kinds of very urgent medical and clinical education, we basically take 1970s style chairs that would have been in old office boardrooms 20, 25, 30 years ago, and we create them into circles and pods, and we arrange the room in such a way that people can see the people convening the room, which would be the teachers or the pedagogues and the tutors, and we move between these spaces and we make sure that they are inside of a place inside of Adler that's often been set up very purposely beforehand. For example, putting out glass vitrines, which are very interesting objects in them, very stimulating texts, photographs, to stimulate their thinking, their critical thinking, to raise historical issues to their awareness, to create a kind of thoughtful, meaningful space for them to be in. So it's not just a box in which they sit. And in this particular case, we had all lived through in the previous 2 weeks a range of pourings out from the heart of young doctors, many of them linked to Wits at Rihanna Musa Hospital, and one particular ex-Wits graduate who was there and who was struggling and who'd finally spoken out and had all been in the press. We used that, but we got them to think about the story of HIV/AIDS, the courage and the advocacy skills that young doctors 30 years ago, 25 years ago had to learn, the interprofessional work that had to happen very, very quickly. We used the poem outside of the HIV timeline exhibition, which speaks about the world of clinical science, of virology, of vaccinology, of work in hematology, and infectious diseases, coming together with issues of care, dignity, respect, resources, and the planning of a response to an evolving pandemic as it was in the late 1990s and early 2000s. We got the students to contemplate and think about that poem and to think of themselves reflected in the glass as young health system science or clinical associate students, to see themselves as they saw others 20, 30 years ago, sometimes people that they have been taught by, and certainly people whose work they've read. And then we came around and we sat in these groups, and we specifically initially kept the clinical associate group in one space, and the health system science students in another space. But during the course of our planned interaction in the first hour, we got people to get up and blend groups. And we set them a series of reflective tasks after we had taken them through the sort of burning crisis of what the doctors and the nurses and health professionals at Rahana Musa were saying. And then after they discussed that, and after we'd drawn out some very specific challenges and points specifically around infrastructure, but not only, around responsiveness, around the Hippocratic Oath, around the kinds of clinical care that can be given under certain conditions, about resource constraints, about issues of accountability, about Section 27 of the Constitution, about the legal forensic framework that the young practitioners were finding themselves in. After we'd set that all out, we then set them the task of coming up with an intervention that in an interprofessional way and addressing health systems challenges could make a difference. And then we spent about half an hour unpacking in these small groups, and then they present to each other. And it was truly extraordinary, some of the innovative ideas they come up with. In fact, we captured some of these and we shared them with people interested in health innovations in our faculty. Some of the examples were very low tech and involved a different way of organizing resources that already exists through more old-fashioned forms of communication, and I suppose you could say tried and tested methods of interprofessional regard. Others involved research and writing projects and communicating to the public. Others involved working with lawyers and with other kinds of advocates, and yet still others involved the creation of apps and actual technical devices and quick wins with hierarchies. Stephen and I, our minds were completely blown. The clinical associates said that they felt that the systems thinking and the quick sort of move to innovation that the health systems science students brought forward really lit their brains up. And from the point of view of the health system scientists, they felt that they really had a real check on some of their more high-flown ideas or impractical ideas by talking with people who had real clinical skills and had been in and out of the platform of clinics and hospitals around Wits, you know, their entire degrees up to that point, and some of them had actually been at Rihanna Musa. So that combination produced real electric energy, and the room went from people feeling despairing and depressed and feeling that their skills were not really they couldn't be mobilized in any way that was of any significance, to leaving feeling empowered with good ideas, with questions to ask, with research they wanted to do, and with techniques that they wanted to try. Stephen, I hope you feel that's a fair summary.
Yeah, that's a very detailed one. Thank you. And I also really found it valuable with that the clinical associates were able to give much better context from a district hospital perspective around what they witness on a daily basis to our health system science students who don't get the opportunity to move through those spaces very often. So they might come up with a solution that they think might work, and the clinical associate will say, well, you know, this just wouldn't be practical for these reasons, or these are the kinds of things we're witnessing, and then there would be a kind of a rebuttal. Well, then what are the processes to talk through management structures, for example? And the clinical associates would recognize that they didn't know how to do that. And at the same time, the health system science students recognized the kind of work that the clinical associates were doing in those hospitals. So there were other things that were happening, I think, that were quite, in that sharing moment, that was quite valuable. This is just one example of how we've managed to put classes together to share ideas and to direct them towards what we're trying to achieve in the session. And then here on my screen, I've got another example of an engagement that we've had with the clinical associates by themselves. And what we've managed to do with our colleagues in the program is to develop or have some input from the first, second, and third year, where we address kind of critical issues or critical understanding of what health systems are, how they work, the component parts, that kind of stuff from the beginning. But we move up until the third year, where we start to talk about the relationship between, for example, history and health systems and what people are experiencing. And what we do specifically for the clinical associates is draw attention to the history of that degree program, how it merged, how there was resistance against it, its link to social medicine, how it re-emerged later, and giving them that kind of context. But what's important here is this is an example of how we use various lenses. The previous lens that we discussed was an advocacy lens to address a systems problem. In this instance, we're using a historical lens to try and give deeper context to what people experience. So, as obviously this is a good point for you, Catherine, as an historian, to say like, well, how is it that we've been using these various lenses to shift or to develop, encourage students to see links between what they encounter in their everyday and where these things might come from.
Yes, and I'm very keen on seeing what our colleagues might think. I see Sabir has to go to another meeting, and it would be lovely to get input. I think many of our very hardworking colleagues, Stephen, have this overwhelming sense, and we get that talking with them and talking with people in the Centre for Health Science Education who, you know, coordinating a lot of this kind of research in our faculty, that they feel so pressed that time is of the essence, and there's so much to cover in content, so many skills that have to be conveyed and practiced. But some of our colleagues in places like the simulation lab, such as Nabila Suji and her technical team and others, I think are beginning to see what we see too, and that is that having a story and a narrative around and through which you can place scientific, clinical, practiced, laboratory, informational material doesn't undermine the scientific outcomes or the clinical outcomes of student education in the health sciences. It helps to hold and frame it. It gives value to the science because it's science not only for the sake of science, or clinical instruction or technique not only for its sake, but it's the missing link, isn't it, between patient-centered care. And it also points to the value of the learner. So it's not only the patient and the patient-centered care or the systems that needs to be taken, or the good scientific practice collective, the Cochrane-style evidence-based medicine collective that is being nourished and spoken up and storied. It's also the journey of the learner, the person becoming gradually more and more proficient, failing but failing better, because we're all failing but failing better, and the person finding when they are good enough. And in order to make that story meaningful and not filled with platitudes or a sort of Pollyanna story, there has to be a lot of critical energy in that, Stephen. So, for example, the clinical associate is such an amazing story to tell. And it's fascinating for health system students and people doing medicine and nursing to hear it too. Because sometimes people think, oh, duh, obviously we can have doctors and nurses. But what we're saying is no, 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 no. In order for this kind of an idea to emerge in society over time of what a doctor is, and this kind of an idea to emerge of the scope of practice of a nurse, these things had to happen. And doctors and nurses now are seen to work together. There are more and more women doctors. There are quite a few male nurses, but initially they were gendered, and in our country, they were also, and other countries, they were also raced and had hierarchies in them. What about these mid-level workers that are such important go-betweens? They're kind of bricoleurs, they are tinkers, and they move between these places and open up space. They are so effective, and they're considered the backbone of the health system in many countries in the world with very effective health systems. How did South Africa begin to think about having a clinical associate, sometimes under a different name? And why was this plan, which reached, you know, all the way to parliamentary white paper status, why was this quashed? Under what star, with what politics and ideology, with what scientific evidence, if any? And what did South Africa lose out on because of this, which has also perverted and misshapen the role of doctors, and also has perverted and misshapen some of the potential of nursing. And if people can see this, then it strips the normative view of what a health professional in this degree or this degree looks like, and it shows people that human beings make scope of practice. This is an iterative and dialogical process. It's not set in stone. It's dynamic and changing. And just in the last 100 years in South Africa, in Johannesburg, it's changed 3 or 4 times. This knowledge and the knowledge of key actors in that, the policies that were made, the fights that were held, the struggles that were brought to the fore, and the evidence that was brought forward at different times. This really gets a young, for example, clinical associate in trainings person's mind thinking, and it gets them to think about possibilities, about doors that open and close, about innovative thinking, and it also nourishes their sense of personal autonomy and journey. And so that's the reason why the story and the history is important for the science, for the practical application, for the content knowledge, and for the grit and determination of the professional to be.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you for that. And this is just, of course, one lens that is valuable, but we also then like to take the same kinds of issues that we discuss and think through them from different frameworks or different viewpoints, be it ethical, be it something like an efficiency or effectiveness or accessibility framework. And when we give students a chance to assess kind of complex issues from different points of view, different lenses through which you would read that, they start to see connections between them even better. So what we've done also to stimulate this thinking is to develop these courses, particularly as writing intensive programs, which is, and again, another strategy for developing systems thinking. And here are just examples of 3 briefs across the 3 years of different kinds of writing practice that we build. For example, in first year, we start with reflective writing practice. In the second year here, we've got our history essay that our students are currently writing. So we don't expect them to write a history essay as if they were history students. We expect them to write it from a health system science perspective. But you can see that we carry that lens through into the writing practice. And the same kind of strategy is applied across all these different tasks, is that we want students to be able to formulate a very clear argument, to find evidence that supports what they're trying to say from appropriate sources, various sources, and also to develop different kinds of writing aimed at different audiences that they might encounter in their professional life. And we find it's a fantastic way to get students to start to, for example, see connections by reading and making links between different source material and the theory that is taught in class and the context that we're giving them. Do you want to come in here, Catherine?
Just once, I'm so glad you mentioned reading. You know, everyone will be aware that our National Minister of Primary Education has released the results of a huge study after a big meeting in Stellenbosch somewhere to gather together all the primary education experts in the whole country. And several reports were released on the same day, and 2 books have been published about the fact that South Africans are not reading for meaning or content right from when they're very little people in the age group 6 to 8. And there's also falling reading rates into their teen years, and also there's evidence for this at the tertiary level. And of course, South African children and students are being compared with students in our subcontinental region, and then I think there's 6 countries we compare to, and then benchmarked also with readers abroad. And one of the challenges is the same as everyone faces: time on screens, cost of books, and so on and so forth. But another area that we really fall down on is being able to figure out how a text is constructed. So starting from being a very small child, and in South Africa we now obviously promote as a part of human rights, children learning in their mother tongue or their vernacular first, and then going into other languages if that's what happens and that's what their families and them want, or that's what the school feeder districts have. And then, of course, in the case of places like WITS, we have this international colonial origin language that we're using. But in all of these reports, we see the same thing. Young people, even by the age of 15, can't figure out how the authorial voice is constructed. The difference between quotation and citation and referring to other things, and the voice, the first person or third person voice of the author. So, for example, if they get a text that's constructed by a group of scientific authors, they battle to see when the literature review or citation or annotated bibliography or referring to studies that come before part of the work is there, and the secondary or tertiary characteristics, which is the group of authors or author digging down into their findings, their assertions, their questions, and so on. And so when they come to university, it's incredibly difficult for them to unpack academic texts that presume that they've got all those reading skills already. So one of the things that Stephen and I have spent a lot of time on, and Stephen is absolutely committed to this and draws in professionals from the WITS Writing Centre as well as research to do this, is that we show people how a text is made. So, for example, if you take writing about the COVID pandemic, it will refer back to other pandemics, and it's therefore historical. So even though, for example, Professor Mahdi, our dean, might be writing, or the key author, in a text about testing different vaccine regimes, the text will begin with a highly compressed historical set of claims, arguments, and reviews. And if we show them how you can pull these out or stretch them out in an accordion and look into the layers that go into that tightly compressed opening section or opening set of claims and hypotheses. And to do that, we take them again into Once Upon a Time, which is a very worked through pedagogy in South African schools at the moment. Even though lots of kids get this still at home and around the dinner table or around the fireplace, it's simply not happening in schools. So we say, once upon a time there was the Spanish influenza epidemic. Once upon a time Joburg was formed out of a mining camp. Once upon a time WITS came to be. Once upon a time an infectious disease specialization emerged. Once upon a time legislation and policies. And this historicity, which is not the way a history student would do it year after year in the history department. It's like a platforming, it's like a series of palimpsests or layers.
I seem to have lost Catherine. I don't know if other people have the same challenge. I can't see I can only see my screen right now. Okay, so let me continue. Thank you for that. Just my last point before we open up to the floor is that part of this way of thinking is that we've also shifted our essentially high stakes assessment practice. So we do have an exam equivalent that takes the kind of shape of a take-home sort of exam. But the idea is that we want students to have a platform through which to show how they are making links across course material. And so what we've opted for is a portfolio of learning, which is actually a portfolio of evidence of their learning, and that gives them a space to showcase, for example, different kinds of skill sets that we've been teaching in the course, but also allows them a level of creativity and flexibility to to position themselves within what we're teaching. So, for example, here I have a brief for a final year portfolio submission with 3 different tasks that students have to do. One around how we need to adapt to change and within the context of change management, and the kinds of things that we get them to do are the tasks, the interrelated tasks, for example, around scholarship, as I showed earlier, scholarship and systems thinking and advocacy. Those kinds of topics will be centered here, where students have to apply certain kinds of scholarship skills to find material, to then describe or explain their process and why they feel these are suitable sources to support an argument, that kind of thing. We also have an engagement with the students at the end of the year, where we invite them to present on a particular topic, but also for us to interrogate this portfolio of learning and to ask questions around what they've submitted, to get a sense of how they're making links. And we see in this oral viva exam actually how things kind of coalesce in the student, and usually we're quite surprised actually at how students start to draw links between different aspects, particularly in our context of health systems, but they start to make links, for example, with the different lenses or approaches that we've been presenting. So it helps us to get that sense. And of course, this is not appropriate for every single discipline, but it is something that could be developed where all students have some kind of learning portfolio that part of it is linked to their personal learning journey, how they are becoming a person within a profession or within whatever they're trying to achieve, and the kinds of links that they make, not only in the classroom, but as they navigate through life. The kinds of conversations they might hear in the back of a taxi, or attending an art exhibition and things suddenly clicking around material that they are learning, or volunteering and seeing how things are playing out in a different context and relating that to what we're teaching. So we find, I think that's what we're trying to do here, is to create a space that, again, is centered on the student's learning journey, going back to our first slide around learning excellence pedagogy. I think that is, those are the various, those are the various strategies. I'm just going to try exit this. Great. So we have 10 minutes left. I think Catherine has dropped off the call. It's probably got to do with Vit's Wi-Fi. But perhaps I could open up for discussion or questions. And I can look through some of the questions that are posted here to start. Chechofatso is asking, how long are the essays and how many articles are the students expected to reference? How do we encourage students, especially second and first years, in our teaching? So, I mean, this is obviously contingent on the year of study. Students obviously don't write very long essays to begin with. And of course, we're trying to develop their writing practice over time. And I don't think we ever really stipulate how much students have to read. We usually have, like most things, key texts we want students to be making reference to, but we never limit it in that way. We expect students to read. And we expect students we teach them how to find source material, how to evaluate the strength of that material. And of course, what we experience is that students make many mistakes. But that is part of the learning process. We support them with writing fellows who are also our tutors on the course, but that go through a writing intensive training around the kinds of things that they are we trying to develop in students' academic writing skills. I hope that answers your question, Sergio. I see that Michelle has their hand up. Maybe I can hand over to you.
Thank you very much. In terms of critical thinking, which, those are such important words, and if I relate it, well, I can only talk to the discipline that I'm involved with, is when the doctors in the ward or students, whatever, or the health professionals make an assessment nowadays, it really is uniformly across the board stable. And sure, on an initial admission, if it's a diarrhea person, they might say yes, acute GE, but really with no further process documented on paper with regard to degree of dehydration, shock, yes, no, whatever, dysentery, yes, no. So even the beginning, very first admission after clerking, it just is a very abbreviated form. And thereafter, on a daily basis, the assessment is stable. And it's not something that we grew up with. It's not something that they're advocating even in the handbook from this discipline. So to me, that just typifies that in terms of not critical thinking or applying one's mind or whatever it might be. And I really don't know the right words. So how does one start building that culture so that it's not just this thing that says stable, like, a journalist who says, yes, whoever it might be is in a stable condition as opposed to critical. But this is the medical side. And I think it's so important to apply your minds and show critical thinking when you're making an assessment on a daily basis on the patient. Thank you.
Yeah, Michelle, I don't have the answer to that because my background is not clinical. But what I would say is that these kinds of skills that we're developing should facilitate clinical decision making, because the processes are not that different. We can only hold so many thoughts in our mind at one point in time. I forget what the link is here around how we make a clinical diagnosis, right? The kinds of processes that one would follow. We can only draw up so much memory, right? And I think that one of the things to be teaching are where our limitations are, and of course within reason, because people have to make decisions quickly. But I mean, there's such a difference, for example, when one consults a homeopath. People that I've consulted previously, for example, are not scared to consult multiple texts while in consultation, to say, listen, I got to look at these different things just to make links for myself to try and understand what's happening in front of me. And of course, but that does take more time. So I think in terms of how we develop writing practice, and writing as critical thinking, not writing for writing's sake, and writing as very strongly linked to reading and how we read and how we make sense of texts. There's similar kinds of processes that one has to follow in terms of making those arguments, will mirror in many ways, I think, clinical decision-making tool or processes too. I know other people have actually written about this and made those links a bit better than I can articulate here. I hope that stimulates some thinking. Daniela, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Stephen and Kath, for your presentation. So I was just thinking a little bit about what you had said about writing and a culture of reading. I believe we do need a culture of reading. But I just wanted to know the type of skills that the students learn in terms of writing. And I don't know if you've, and I assume you probably have come across, but there's actually even, I think, courses about writing well for government. And I sometimes think about, what we're trying to do with health system sciences, and I just want to know about the writing skills they develop. Are they writing skills that are fit for purpose in terms of, do they develop the skills for proposal writing, seeking grants, proposal writing in terms of, not proposal writing, but contracts from government agencies, and even a few other skills that I wanted to know or that get discussed, is that, can a graduate who, goes through this systems thinking, has these skills, could they be even fit for understanding how to lead change? And what are those specific skills that would get us to say, okay, upon receiving this qualification, you have the right skills for leading change? Because I think that's one of the core things we need of people in this country, and specifically people that want to go into the government and transform and create these systems. So it's in two parts. So the one thing is the skills, writing for government, and what are the skills you develop that they can be leaders for change. And another one. I just thought about whether the idea of financial management and budgeting is something that, when we think of systems, money, money, money. So is that something that exists, is discussed, or perhaps just to introduce it, I don't know at what level, but financial management and budgeting?
Thanks for that. Yeah. So it's interesting. Somebody actually said to me yesterday that somebody who works abroad and is not South African, that they're always impressed with how the kind of creativity that they find in many sectors, or most sectors in South Africa, where there's like really interesting things that are generated, really smart people, really interesting ideas happening for our context, except for our government. And that's the one area where creativity is just not present. Just to answer your question, what we actually do in terms of writing skills is not necessarily to develop like full competence, for example, on how to write certain kinds of things, like as you said, how to develop grant writing. What we do that cuts across all the activities is how to make an argument, how to situate an argument, and what is the implications of the stance that you're taking. Why is it necessary? And what evidence do you draw upon to support your line of argument? And I guess we can link that again to like how we form a social subject, like as we discussed last week, that acts within a citizenry that goes out to challenge where certain kinds of practices that are perhaps unjust. How do they do that, right? So so whether it's a reflective article, an opinion piece, a brief or report, a history essay, an ethics essay, the same kind of practice is developed. And of course, how we make those arguments within those different forms of writing are different, even though there's similarities. So I think central to that then is, again, how we situate the audience to which you're writing. So, for example, why if you are producing research, why it's important to be able to summarize that research into a one-pager that really highlights what this is trying to achieve. Because we know, for example, that if that's landed on the desk of somebody in government, they're not going to read the full report, they're going to read the executive summary. And how does that executive summary then reflect the key argument that's being made in what they're saying? We do expose students more than teach them, because we don't have the space really. And also, we're not interested necessarily in whether students write well. This is not an English language or academic English course, because we can still discern if students do not necessarily write particularly well. We can still discern their line of argument, the kind of material that they're drawing on to support this argument, regardless of how many grammatical errors they make. That being said, one of the things we emphasize is attention to detail, and that you had to develop strategies in order to get this information across to people in a way that is meaningful and that presents as professional. In terms of the financing material, of course, that is actually an area of a content area that we teach around how health systems are financed, but we don't go into kind of the accounting skills that one might need to draft a budget, for example. So we might work with existing budgets, but we wouldn't go into that much detail in our courses, at least in undergraduate. There's definitely scope, I would say, for us to develop those kinds of skills and courses in short courses that different students from different programs could elect to take, I think that could really work very well, depending on what they're trying to achieve. Do you want to come in here again, Daniela?
Yeah, I'm just, and this is just for your, because I've been thinking about it so much that I think in writing, we teach our students to write for a particular audience. So the SOAP notes, I'm looking at our assignments. So the SOAP notes, the progress notes, it's about medical documentation audience, right? It's us as colleagues communicating to each other. And then it's the publications or these research publications, because then it's, again, the audience is fellow scientists, fellow researchers. And then we say that we do research to inform other researchers and stakeholders. And, I've yet to see a operational stakeholder, strategic stakeholder sit with a journal article. Whereas they prefer, I've seen them sit with reports, I've seen them sit with proposal documents. And so this is the thing when I think about some of our writing activities that are sometimes used for assessments, is there a space for proposal writing, for report writing, for writing briefs or submissions? Is there even, okay, perhaps I like what you said, maybe an exposure, not so much teaching. But I feel like with health sciences, that sometimes what then gets some people really frustrated is that they don't develop these skills for writing certain particular documents, even proofing or editing some of these documents, and even stakeholder communication is something where I feel usually it's something, if you're lucky to get into a particular organization that develops those skills for you, but it's not something, and hence I think also I just think about this this idea of when we do try to lead change as healthcare workers, we sometimes don't know, but I see it so well in the civil society movements, where there's people that know how to write really good reports, really good stakeholder communications. They know how to, if there's a particular passion project that they have that they need funding, they're really good at harnessing like proposal documents and things like that. I also speak maybe from my own limitations, that but I feel like I've seen with other colleagues. So yeah, that's just my comment.
No, thank you for sharing that. And also it's about translating evidence into practice. I think that's really important. For example, I mean, Prof. Cook is saying how to read or write a policy versus how to write a standard operating procedures, or what the difference is and how one would communicate a message across to people, and who you're communicating it to, and how clearly it is put across. We actually currently teaching this topic in our course around health policy, like what is the purpose of it, how does one read a policy, what is the process that unfolds when policies are developed and implemented, where are the sticking points, how does one analyze whether a policy is successful or not. And we wouldn't necessarily get students to focus on any particular policy, because we don't want them to know necessarily the details of a policy. We want them to be able to apply that approach to any policy that they might encounter in the future. And then again, to develop a critical lens to say, well, what are the challenges or around this? Because we know, of course, in this context that policy is, there's a gap between policy implementation and policy development and policy implementation. And what are the factors that often have nothing to do with the policy itself, that prevent these things from happening? So getting them to see those links, be they, for example, the way in which finances are managed or resources are put together. Right. That was just an example that came to my mind. I see that our time is up. Catherine's back on the call. Do you have any last thoughts, Catherine?
Not really. I'm just so excited to hear colleagues asking, very specific questions about, like Chekofatso, about exactly how much they expect you to read, and very specific genre questions about writing from Daniela. But just to end maybe from my side on this thought, that one of the things that Mark Haywood and a lot of people like Michelle Banda, who was born in South Africa, though of Malawian origin, and who writes for the Daily Maverick all the time on health, excellent piece she wrote today on cholera in Hammanskraal. All of the really outstanding journalists like Ferial Haffajee and others that we have in this country, award-winning. I'm thinking of someone like Fred Kumalo, who's also written outstanding books about Thabo Mbeki, health policy, and so on. They say the most important thing before you hone in on your genre skills, you know, like how to write a particular kind of template document, a policy or a standard operating procedure or something else, is to be able to more confidently apprehend a research question and then know that you can read for information about that. And that's a prior step. I think what we're often doing at universities to fill these gaps is that we're teaching people genre-specific things first, instead of this rich reading, writing, critical thinking, discussing, reading, writing paradigm to draw like a golden thread through all forms of education. And I think that, you know, South African university life is going to rise and fall in whether we find appropriate, meaningful, persuasive ways to bring this into these extremely content-heavy disciplines. It's a huge challenge for people trained in the humanities like Stephen and me, and we are doing everything we can to rise to the challenge, also humbly and in the presence of such hardworking colleagues in the clinical space. But I do feel we're getting there. Gancani. Thank you.
Thanks for those final words. Thanks, Catherine. And final thanks to everyone who joined today. We appreciate your time. And yeah, we'll see you next week. Next week, the idea is actually to work to have a kind of workshop where we can look at some of these strategies and see how they might apply specifically in your courses, where there might be opportunities, for example, to develop reading practice, or perhaps even interprofessional practice, the kinds of topics that we could discuss, that kind of thinking. I think that's where what we're aiming towards. So hopefully, yeah, we'll see you next week. Please join us. Thanks again.